God speaks to us in scripture, preaching, song, and prayer. A reading from Psalms. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, then were we like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter, and our tongue with shouts of joy. Then they said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are glad indeed. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like the watercourses of Negeb. Those who sowed with tears will reap songs of joy. Those who go out weeping, carrying the seed, will come again with joy, shouldering their sheaves. Word of God, word of life. Thanks be to God.
The Holy Gospel according to St. John. Glory to you, O Lord. Now 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" Now he said this not because he cared about the poor, but because Judas Iscariot was a thief. He kept the common purse, and he used to steal what was put into it. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated.
Morning, church. Good to see all of you here today. When I think of my friend Eddie, he's in a hospital gown, tented across his broad chest on bony shoulders. I don't remember what kind of cancer he had, but it was the kind that strangles you so slowly that you think it's worth fighting, so you fight. But you cede territory in every battle. Eddie was tall in a way that made him imposing even in a hospital bed, and he was bald but strove to remain clean-shaven even in a hospital bed. I doubt Eddie ever met someone who could intimidate him, but I'm certain at some point somewhere Eddie was someone's worst nightmare. Cancer made him lean, which just made him look tougher. But for all this, the thing I could never stop noticing about Eddie were his tattoos. I often found myself regarding the tattoos that circled each of his wrists just above his hands, 2 thick chains. I never had the courage to ask Eddie what those tattoos represented, but they came to mean something to me. They were a reminder of the pretty tough history that he didn't want to talk about, but often alluded to, saying things like, "Oh, Pastor, I've done some things in my day." I think Eddie knew what it meant to feel fettered to a sinful past, shackled to moments of regret. And in the time I knew him, Eddie was certainly chained to a hospital bed, so Eddie knew both what it meant to be bound to forces in his history and to this illness he could not escape. Because of this, Eddie never came to church. But that was okay. This whole season of Lent, we've been telling you God goes with you anywhere. And Eddie and I just made a habit of practicing that. Almost every time I saw Eddie in the hospital, I just brought my little communion kit. So after we talked about the weight he would carry, I'd set the table, and we would pray and thank God for loving us, and I would place some bread in those hands bound with chains. And every time, Eddie would eat that meal, and he would sigh with relief. So, when we say that God is with you wherever you are, Eddie knew all about that. But even if that's what you believe, faithful people still occasionally find themselves in a place where it seems not even God can go. You know, one of my visits with Eddie, we talked about an experience just like that. It was late in the day when I arrived at the hospital. I parked in the wrong place, had to walk around the whole building. And by the time they let me in, it was after visiting hours, so they had to kick the family out, but they thankfully let me stay. It was a good thing we were alone, because that day Eddie wanted to tell me a terrifying story. The night before, in that solitary hour, deep after midnight, long after shift change and doctor's rounds, Eddie said he had a visitor. The visitor looked like a nurse or a doctor, but it wasn't, and Eddie saw right through the disguise. Eddie knew who it was, and the thought paralyzed him, pinned him in place. It was the devil. And Eddie yelled for help, begged for a nurse to come, but they were alone, the devil and him, and the devil threatened him, mocked him, spoke his secrets. Eddie was terrified. Eddie believed this was real, and I am not in the position to say what he saw. I could just tell you that night, Eddie felt trapped by the presence of evil and by the pressure of death. He felt ashamed and violated. He wept as he told me about this. And Eddie asked me why God would let him experience that. He wanted to know what it meant. Right away, my mind went to the theological. I thought about angels and demons and the devil and the way we explain our relationship with those supernal powers. But Eddie didn't care about all that. His question was relational. Eddie had always welcomed God's presence as a friend, a defender, a companion. Eddie just wondered, where was that God when I needed God the most? And I didn't have an answer to a question like that. Today, I still don't have an answer to where God goes in the moment God seems distant, but I do know that even Jesus' closest friends ask questions like that. We see it right in the gospel. In today's reading, we met the family that asked those questions. It's Mary and Martha and Lazarus, these people who were close friends with Jesus, but just 1 week before, they were entirely surrounded by evil and death, and Jesus, nowhere to be found. That week, the brother Lazarus struggled for his life against some kind of fatal illness. Maybe he had cancer. The sisters believed. They just believed that if Jesus would come to them and be with them, he could make things better. And I imagine them reassuring Lazarus, comforting him out of the promise of their faith, just telling him that Jesus would come. But as the hours thinned for Lazarus and the sisters desperately sent word to Jesus, it got too late. In time, Lazarus couldn't wait any longer for a friend who would never arrive, and he died. His sisters buried him, but they kept their questions alive. So when Jesus finally did show up, that was what Jesus walked into. Jesus walked right into all those live questions, their painful grief, their demolished expectations, their aching disappointment. And you know, in the end, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. But today, I want to talk about why. Why does Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead? The answer's pretty simple. It's not because he loves Lazarus necessarily. I mean, in fact, we don't really hear anything about Lazarus before this. Lazarus could have meant nothing to Jesus, but Lazarus meant everything to his sisters. And their grief, the power of it affected Jesus. His friends were honest with him. They poured out their hearts to him. They were respectful, but they did share their disappointment. They didn't hold back their grief. They were just honest with Jesus. And I think provoked by this raw honesty of their friendship and provoked by his love for them, Well, that's when Jesus tells him to roll away the stone. And that's when he shouts to Lazarus. And then it's Lazarus' turn to be provoked by God's own undeniable love. Lazarus shambles out of the tomb bound in grave clothes, but otherwise perfectly alive. So you see what happens here. There's a relationship, a full and beautiful and complicated relationship, and Jesus raises Lazarus because of that. Okay, so a week later, Jesus joins this family for dinner. This is what we read from the gospel today. But of course the girls are going to want to give Jesus some kind of gift that night, right? True to form, Martha gives Jesus the gift of hospitality. I imagine she cooked with such love. Well, what could Mary give? Had to be more than a card that said, "Thank you for raising my brother from the dead," right? It had to be a gift, like a thoughtful gift, thoughtful enough to honor their whole relationship, and I believe that's the kind of gift she gave when she poured out that perfume. It's much more than just a thank you. It's much more than something just valuable. In part, it's also an act of healing, where Mary uses the complicated beauty of a fragrance to wipe away any resentment, any shadow of hurt feelings that she had felt from the week before. But beyond that, this is also a gift that speaks to the power of love in the face of death. And Jesus tells us as much. He recognizes that Mary has saved this perfume for his burial. And that kind of seems like a weird thing to say, but when a guy your age dies, you kind of start thinking about the end, right? Beyond that, by this point, Jesus has been talking about his own death. He's been dropping down hints about laying down his own life. So I just believe in that moment, Jesus is worried about death. He's worried about his own body, worried about his own suffering. And Mary understands that, especially after what she went through with her brother the week before. So she chooses a gift that she can use to care for Jesus' body in the face of his death. So like any good and precious and thoughtful gift, this oil, this perfume, and the tenderness with which she pours it out and sops the excess with her hair, I think you can see it means many things. It means thank you. It means I'm sorry and I love you. It means I know that you are afraid of what they're going to do to you, but to me, you are precious. It means even when I doubted you, you were there for me, and now I will be here for you. What if this was your friend? Oh man, wouldn't you feel deeply touched by a gift like that? Wouldn't you want to respond? This relationship Jesus shared with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, it was so personal for him, so loving and moving that Jesus does respond to them with his whole self. But that also means that Jesus responds as God. And the second Jesus responds as God, it becomes about so much more than this back and forth between friends. It becomes a statement about the entire relationship between God and people, where each offering given by people is magnified by God to satisfy the whole world. So at the tomb of Lazarus, Jesus responds to all human grief by showing that God intends to dispose of death once and for all. And after Mary pours out this perfume, after she pours out every ounce of her love, Jesus responds to her generosity. Jesus takes the pattern of care that she shows, and Jesus repeats it on the night he is betrayed. That night, Jesus washes the feet of his friends just as Mary had washed his. That night, Jesus doesn't have perfume, but Jesus does pour out a love offering of his own. Jesus pours out his very life. Jesus pours out body and blood, and this is a gift so precious and personal and so abundant that it overflows their relationship to affect us all. It wipes away every sin with God's tender care, and it becomes a gift where God says, I love you, and I care for you. And I know you are worried about your death, but to me you are priceless. It means even when you doubted me, I was there for you all the way to the grave, and I am still here for you today. So this gift-giving begins as love between Jesus and Mary, but it becomes the promise that all of us need to share. Because there comes a day, right, when you find yourself far from God's presence and you ask every terrible question about what this means for your relationship with God. You feel yourself trapped by evil and harnessed by the power of death. And you may even provoke God with your honesty, your disappointment, your frustration, your sadness. In a more beautiful time, you could feel God's sense of love and care. And in those moments, you might provoke God with your generosity and your affection. And we can do these things because we are in a relationship with a God who truly loves us, and because we believe that when all seems lost, Jesus returns to us to pour out the complicated fragrance of healing. So it was the day when my friend Eddie died. Those last few months, I think it was love that kept him alive. Eddie had a fiancée. When Eddie talked about her, his eyes sparkled. Eddie fought every day to live just so he can spend another hour with her. And for a time there'd been hope. One Christmas, he even came to church on crutches. I didn't recognize him because he wasn't in a hospital gown. But every day after that, his sturdy bones dwindled. By that September, his fiancée and I were emailing about wedding liturgy because we knew we were running out of time. And that following December, the day came when there was no more time to waste. So we did it. High in the strange circular tower at Stony Brook University Hospital, her family prepared a hospital room for a wedding. They found this white sport coat for Eddie to wriggle into. They got a cake, gave me the marriage license. I brought Holy Communion because Eddie wouldn't worship without it. The bride arrived in her lovely dress. Everyone gathered in the room. The bride's dad walked her down the hallway past all the other hospital rooms. She and Eddie held hands as I married them, with him in the hospital bed and her standing by his side. I awkwardly pulled around that little wheelie table that slides over the hospital bed. You know the one I'm talking about? And there in that room with all its beeping monitors in the presence of God and in the shadow of death, that table became our altar. I set out the bread and wine. We prayed for the nurses by name, and then we shared the most precious thing we had. We poured out the wine until its complicated fragrance filled the room. We broke the bread. We passed around the love of God. And in that moment, this man who had such a history and this woman who only wanted to share the threadbare scraps of his future, they ate their first meal together as husband and wife, and it was that holy meal. Friends, Eddie had his days, his years, when he wondered if God was with him. He felt chained and trapped by illness, by death, by the devil. But in that room, that day, there was no doubt that God was with them. 2 weeks later, Eddie died. It's 4 days after Christmas. Those last few years, Eddie fought every day to live for his bride. But he died knowing Jesus would go with him even when she could not. And today I tell you, the next time we see him, none of us will wear chains.